Hi, everybody. This is Adam Serwer from Mother Jones, and you're watching Adamize. I'm here with David Gartenstein-Ross, who's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. How are you doing, David?
I'm doing great, Adam. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you as well. And so, this episode is going to be devoted to the tragic events of last week in Boston, but particularly, David and I want to talk about the motive behind the bombing, since that's obviously everybody's been focused on that, and why the attack occurred, why the attackers wanted to bomb the Boston Marathon. Was it an issue of religious identity, national identity? And I think we're sort of starting to get hints of that coming out now. I had sort of a weird experience on Friday where I think I was one of the first people to report on any sort of tangible evidence that either of the suspects had been radicalized, because I found the sort of a video on Tamerlan's YouTube page that was devoted to the prophecy of the Black Banners, which is this sort of very questionable hadith, which is saying of the prophet. About a sort of invincible army that's going to come from Central Asia, and this sort of like weird Armageddon end times thing that Al Qaeda's people are constantly citing, in justification. Obviously, Al Qaeda has their black flag, but I also didn't want to necessarily. I wasn't necessarily sure that. I mean, the fact that the brother has been the older brother seems to have been radicalized. I don't think the younger brother, Dzhokhar, who survived, obviously the older brother died in a shootout with the cops. He doesn't seem to have been quite as have been quite as observant as his older brother, whom everyone, all of the sort of friends and family members have said, began to grow more and more observant in the months prior to the attack.
Right, and not quite as observant is obviously a tremendous understatement.
Right.
Tamerlan was, by external indicators, quite pious. He stopped listening to music, even decided to stop boxing because he thought that was potentially un-Islamic. Whereas, Dzhokhar not only was a drinker, but he's someone who, right after carrying out the bombing, went out to a dorm party.
Right.
If looking at his Twitter feed, you have both some indications of religiosity, like an interesting reference to Juma prayers. You also get a lot of very clear hip hop references as well. He has a very different pattern than the older brother does.
He's very. I mean, like, you look at his Twitter feed, and there are like occasional references to like religious politics.
Right.
But it's very much sort of what you'd expect from a 19-year-old. He's talking a lot about girls.
Yeah.
At one point, he brags about being the beer pong champ of Cambridge, which, if Dzhokhar is motivated by religion, he's got to be the first like jihadist / beer pong champ who's ever existed. But like, I think his, so we, the Tamerlan's religious views and religious and political views have sort of brought to the forefront this debate that I think we're sort of constantly having with regards to terrorism, which is whether you can conflate, religious observance, being a religious Muslim, with a tendency to act violently. And I think, if people who believe that think that Tamerlan is strong evidence for their argument, Dzhokhar is like strong evidence to the opposite, right? I mean, this is a guy who said, I think yesterday the story came out that he got caught drinking Busch Light in a parking lot by the cops, which is just like, he's behaving in a lot of ways like, just on his Twitter feed, quoting rap lyrics, bragging about girls drinking. He's behaving in like many ways like a very typical teenager.
Right.
He's like a fan of Game of Thrones, except that he, it appears that he helped his brother carry out this horrific attack on the Boston Marathon.
Right, and the debate that you're talking about, I think, it tends to be a very confused debate, in part because things in the public sphere tend to get confused. So I think that you articulated it exactly correctly, which is is observance, is religious observance, and let's be clear, when people say this, they mean is Islamic religious observance something that can be conflated with a tendency to violence. Whereas, careful researchers, and I hope that I could put myself in this category, tend to look at it slightly differently, because it's not religious observance writ large. It's rather a specific interpretation of the faith, which sometimes is referred to as Salafi jihadism. Salafi jihadism being a compound term. The first part of that, Salafism, being a movement that tries to replicate Islam as Salafis believe was practiced by the first 3 generations of Muslims. For that reason, they tend to be very austere and also very legalistic, thinking that the faith has been corrupted over time by generations who aren't sticking to the core text, to the Quran and to the Ahadith. And specifically within Salafism, you also have a number of different movements, one of which is quietist. That is, it eschews involvement in politics. It's sometimes referred to as scientific Salafism. You have some political Salafism, which allows for participation in a political system. Then you have Salafi jihadism, which generally eschews political participation and believes that the system needs to be overturned by revolutionary violence and a religious regime put in its place. When you look at the kinds of observance in Tamerlan, they tend to resonate with other Salafi jihadist cases that I've studied. You have a few indicia of religiosity. I did a study on this back in 2009, which we'll link to, called Homegrown Terrorists in the U.S. and U.K. But as he became more deeply religious, he undertook certain steps, including trying to impose his beliefs on others, and several very austere steps that are in line with other Salafi jihadist cases. And I'm not going to outline all the evidence right now because I don't want to filibuster you. But the other thing I'll say is that also careful researchers note that there's not one single path towards undertaking jihadi violence. And if I were putting money on it, and as you and I have talked, it's a little bit too early to definitively say that we know the motive now, less than 2 weeks later. But if I were putting money on it, what it seems to me is that Tamerlan has a fairly typical ideological journey. It can be bolstered by other factors, but it certainly seems to be a very ideological journey, and he seems to be sincerely religious. Whereas in Tamerlan's case, I think that it's quite likely...
You mean in Djokar's case?
In Djokar's case, I apologize. It seems quite likely that something else was going on. Maybe it's familial bonds, maybe it's political anger, maybe it's wanting to build his prestige and sense of purpose, but it doesn't seem to me like his is an ideological radicalization.
Well, so I obviously don't know half as much about this as you do, but my sort of working theory for this is that it's really important to distinguish between religion, thought of as observance, belief, faith, and religious identity politics, which I think is something that exists independent of those things. And when I refer to religious identity politics, I want to make clear that, I think some forms of religious identity politics are perfectly good or neutral. I think about, in the United States, the American Jewish identity is very much tied in with sort of a conception of social justice, regardless of whether you go, and a lot of American Jews self-identify that way, regardless of whether or not they go to temple or not, and how frequently they go to temple or whether they observe at all. There's this sort of sense that being Jewish means, being involved in certain social causes. But the negative, there's also a sort of negative form of religious identity, which is, I think, possibly what was going on with Dzhokhar, which is that he might not have been, observant, but he had this, he developed this sort of political identity, that he shared with his brother, even if he didn't share his brother's sort of piety, and this sort of extremist political identity, which I think is, the more relevant factor, right? I mean, they may have shared, the two of them share a religion with, 1 billion people, but their politics is, from what we're hearing, their politics is what they share with extremists. And I think that's and I don't want to discount the role of religion in that. I mean, I just think that it's not, calling it religion is actually, it's not being politically incorrect, it's being incorrect. We're talking about something that is more complicated than just religion, or just you know, I feel like there's in some ways there's a perception that there's some sort of like magic mystical mojo in Islam that like makes people do bad things. When I think that's ignoring sort of ignoring all the other factors that go into a behavior like this actually makes you learn less than you should be learning.
Well, let's focus in on Tamerlan for a second, taking what you were saying. I think that the distinction that you draw is a good one between religious identity politics and religion. But I don't agree with you that talking about religion is a useless concept. And let's say that we can talk about this also outside the context of Islam. And let's begin there, just because I think it makes people less uncomfortable when we talk about this outside the context of Islam. Mm-hmm. Let's take Martin Luther King Jr. Someone, and also in the context of American race relations, the abolitionist movements. Christianity definitely played a strong role. Now, when we say Christianity, we mean their interpretation of Christianity. When you look at the people who King opposed, they were also Christians, and for some of them, their own rather twisted interpretation of Christianity led them to concoct justifications for segregation. But but particularly in King's case, one can say that he was motivated by religion, meaning his interpretation of religion.
Sure.
Likewise, when you look at bad things done in the name of Christianity, look at the Crusades, or a better example even is the Inquisitions. To me, looking at those, it's very clear that the inquisitors were motivated by religion, by their interpretation of religion. There are other interpretations as well, and quite clearly that is not at all a dominant force within Christianity today. But I think that to say that they were only motivated by religious identity politics wouldn't be capturing what motivated people in any of those instances. So turning it to the question of jihadism, I think that if we're having intelligent conversation, we should be less afraid to talk about the role of religion, because when we say that someone was motivated by religion, we mean they were motivated by their own religiosity, which had a particular interpretation, which doesn't speak so much to the religion being practiced by the other 1 billion Muslims, 1.4 billion actually, but rather it speaks to a particularized interpretation. But when you look at Tamerlan, you don't just have his identity politics that are at play, but you also have him taking very concrete steps which indicate a very strict individual piety. The decision to stop listening to music, to stop boxing, those kind of things indicate that he was taking this seriously, not just in a political manner, but also in the personal steps he was taking to make changes to his life that were motivated by his interpretation of religion.
So, okay, so there's a couple of things I'd say about this. I think you make a very good point. I think that, lots of people aren't, when they say motivated by religion, they are deliberately not referring to individual particularized interpretation of religion.
Absolutely.
They are trying to implicate the other 1.4 billion people who follow the religion. And it's sort of like, and I think people are careful about it. And this goes back to the whole political correctness debate. I mean, like, conservatives are constantly criticizing liberals for being very careful with language when it comes to talking about extremist Islam. And I think one of the reasons is that, at least for me, there's a way in which, I'm personally not interested in theological debates to an extent. Like, I have picked my religion, and if I didn't feel like it was better than the other ones, I wouldn't have picked it. And so, like, I don't want to have this sort of, like, which religion is better conversation. But to the extent that we're talking about this stuff, it often seems like what we're really talking about is not particularized individual interpretation, but sort of an almost implicit justification for violent action against people who share those traits. So, there's like, the absolute weirdest response this week has been the sort of weird pile-on Chechnya, even though neither one of the suspects appears to have ever actually visited Chechnya. They were, their families were sort of displaced in one of the many sort of tragic events in that part of the world. But they were born in Dagestan, so they weren't actually they've never actually, Rand Paul introduced a bill saying we should ban immigration from Chechnya. The House subcommittee is having a meeting on like the threat coming from Chechnya. It was just like weird because not only has the Chechnyan Islamist groups never really targeted the United States, but like these two kids who like came here, presumably they hadn't started planning to bomb the Boston Marathon when one was a teenager and the other was 8. But this question of I'm perfectly okay talking about religious motivation as like an individual interpretation of religion,
right.
But I think people are justifiably defensive and, with good reason to avoid implicating innocent people, in just wanting to discuss, like, separate, that extremist interpretation from implicating all these other people who are never going to blow anything up.
So let me take a side point first, and then address your major point. The side point with respect to militant Islam in the Caucasus, I do want to say that I think much more literacy about this, in general, way people want to discuss it, would be worthwhile. And in the case of the Caucasus Emirate, you have a lot of framing of the Caucasus Emirate as being a nationalist group. I think that while I agree with you that they to date have not targeted the United States, Doko Umarov, who is the emir of the Caucasus Emirate, has issued a statement describing the United States as one of his enemies and saying that he thought jihad against the United States was an obligation. That's not to say that they're implicated here, but I think that there are levels of complexity and also a lot of evidence indicating more of a global jihadist frame that's been elided in the discussion. But that's not the major point. Let me just put that to the side, because I felt like I had to respond to that. But with respect to the point that you're making about discourse, I agree with that, Adam. I think that discourse on this subject is often a very ugly thing from more than one side. Not saying that and I'm not saying at all that these sides are equivalent. For me, I find that I realized recently, relatively recently, after having my baby girl, and realizing that my time was so much more limited than it's ever been, that I waste a lot of time reading stupid things, like reading things that I know are going to be utterly dumb. When I see the link on Twitter or wherever, I know that I'm going to hate this, I'm going to disagree, but I read it anyway, and sometimes feel like I need to respond to it because it was so stupid. I recently decided I'm going to stop doing that. That's not to say that I will never read things that I disagree with. In fact, we're far poorer intellectually if we don't read things that challenge us. But stupid things are just not worthwhile. So when I discuss this issue, these issues, radicalization and the role of religion, something I've spent time studying academically, talking about in academic settings and the like, I understand these layers of either stupid or outright ugly discourse that surround it. Which is why it's very important to define our terms, define what we're talking about, and caveat it, because people will make assumptions about what these things mean. But you'll remember that in the first statement I made about pushing back on the idea that talking about the role of religion is unhelpful, I said in intelligent discussions, I think that it's not something that we should avoid. And here we know each other, Adam. We're both people who can discuss these things maturely. And I think that when you're actually having a discussion with other adults and people who don't have sinister motivations, it actually can be helpful to talk about things much more frankly. And in fact, I think actually, and look, this is, I think actually when one looks at the discursive environment, one thing that provides somewhat of a bolster to people who I think can legitimately call Islamophobes is some of the discussion which I think can legitimately be described as being overly politically correct. I think when people feel like questions that they have are off limits and they can't discuss them because they'll be called names and the like, it can make the person who actually is a bigot seem like the only honest guy in the room. Now, that being said, it's a very difficult issue because, how do you deal with this kind of robust and sometimes ugly discursive environment? How do you enable people to ask questions which might actually be somewhat offensive, but coming out of a good nature in that environment? It's not easy at all. But, for my own part, I try to create the kind of discourse and the kind of open environment that I'd like to see, and it sure as hell isn't an easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but as far as the theology thing, so part of what I'm trying to say, you look at the sort of, taking it outside of Islam again. I think the slavery debate is a great example. Frederick Douglass was a huge critic of Christianity, and I think it's like extreme. I think it is someone like, when people sort of talk about the Quran, or they talk about sort of like religious commands as, these super binding things that somehow, people don't have agency to interpret in their own way. I find that really silly, especially when you look at our own history. I'm not the most well versed in Christianity, but I'm pretty sure that, despite the numerous religious justifications for slavery, there's not a whole lot in the New Testament that justifies the Confederacy fighting a war, in order to own people. But you have there were plenty of religious justifications for slavery, just as there were plenty of abolitionists who interpreted the faith to oppose the owning of human beings as chattel. And so I think the problem comes where we sort of act like religion is a kind of weird mind control, weird mystical mind control, rather than acknowledging that a religion is basically what people make it, and people interpret it ultimately. People ultimately interpret it the way that they not want to interpret. I don't think that's right, but they interpret it through the prism of personal experience and structural factors, and those aren't. It's not necessarily the case that because a religious book says this, then it's everybody of that religion is going to interpret that in this really horrifying, strict way.
That's true. I agree with that. But as you said, interpretation tends to be both personal experience and also structural factors.
Right.
And I think that...
But those structural factors, I think, matter than what the book necessarily says, so to speak. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, right. And, there's a big difference, I would say, between Islam and Judaism on the one hand and Christianity on the other. I think, and there's also one big difference, I would say, between Islam and Judaism structurally in terms of the way they interact with the world. Now, the difference, I would say, between Islam and Judaism on the one hand and Christianity on the other is that both Islam and Judaism were state religions. They had very well laid out systems of governance. In the case of Islam under Muhammad and under the first four caliphs after him, under Judaism it goes back much further than that. Whereas in Christianity, Jesus never actually commanded a state, and in fact, a lot of the moves that he made were counteracting stricter interpretations of Judaic law. Such as the let he who's without sin cast the first stone, something which prevented the stoning of an adulteress. To that extent, Christianity has absolutely been used for theocratic rule at a state level. But as Christianity moved away from that, the argument that this is something which is mandated by the religion itself, that it has to be carried out by the state, is one that became less powerful. Within the context of both Judaism and Christianity, and Islam, you have the argument that religion is something that should be implemented at a state level. You have both very ultra-Orthodox politics in Israel making that argument, and then you have quite obviously looking at the world, very powerful Islamist movements in multiple countries, winning elections in Egypt and Tunisia, and coming very close to winning in Libya, which believe that Islam needs to be implemented at a state level, pointing to the respective religious traditions. So absolutely, interpretation makes a difference, but I think also structural factors help to influence that interpretation. And I think that if one wants to look at just how much a religion might change in a certain way, it is, in my view, very ill-advised to ignore those structural factors.
No, I think those structural factors are what we should talk about instead of sort of giving our amateur interpretation, religious interpretation of what the Quran says Muslims should do. like that I'm sort of uninterested in that because I'm not particularly interested in theology. I mean, if someone who's an expert in that field is going to write about it and it's relevant to something I'm writing about, I'll read it.
Right.
But I'm not sort of interested in being like, I just read this and I think it means that.
Yes.
There's a way in which it reminds me a little bit about how everybody becomes an expert on race whenever there's like a racial issue.
Yeah.
Like everybody becomes an expert on the Quran and what the Quran really says when terrorism comes to the forefront. And I'm more interested in the structural factors in part because, just growing up, my personal experience, all the Muslim kids I knew were, it was mostly African American kids, and I didn't have, this whole idea, this balls crazy, anti-Sharia stuff that emerged, from the swamps of the far right over the past couple of years. This is mind-boggling to me in part because the kids that I knew were just like every other kid that I knew. They were in no way different except that they were Muslim and that was their religion and it had nothing to do with anything else.
I think you make good points. Let me put forward just an observation here, which is that, number one, we tend to be very... I think that by and large, if one looks at the way academics and the media tend to treat these issues, they would be in line with what you just articulated. And in general, that's the way I deal with them as well. But to provide some observations which are a little bit to the contrary. Number one, there's a remarkable difference between how we deal with religion and how we deal with ideology. We tend to believe that religion is something where we shouldn't discuss what a religion means. Whereas with ideology, we don't have that problem. So, in terms, if one looks at, say, the ideology of communism, now, obviously, there are multiple kinds of Marxism and things like that, but people have less trouble kind of saying, okay, this is what it means, this is what it says, this is what it means. Same thing with ideologies that we think very poorly of. Nazism, fascism. People don't have trouble ascribing definitive meanings, whereas they do in the case of religion. The second thing I want to point out is that I think it's interesting that we don't really treat all religions the same way in that regard. The religion that I think people tend to be most critical of, that I can see, is Scientology, which, and I'm not saying that it's unjustifiable that Scientology tends to get the bad rap that it does, but people tend to be extremely critical of it and think nothing about that. Whereas, the same sort of criticisms leveled at, Islam or Judaism would get somebody lambasted really quickly. And one final thing is that, to some extent, Christianity is treated a bit differently in the United States, in part, I think, because people think that attacking the majority religion isn't that bad. And a good example, you mentioned Frederick Douglass before, but let's take it also in the context of civil rights and race relations. The autobiography of Malcolm X is a document that lambasts Christianity. It could not possibly be more critical of Christianity. Now, one could argue that that's justified or not, but you would never see, say, Ayaan Hirsi Ali's book, Infidel, treated in the same way. So it's interesting that we have different standards for how we deal with things, and I think that that's problematic, because I think that the intellectual foundation for these different treatments is pretty poorly thought through.
Okay, so I'm going to defend Malcolm real quick and point out that while Malcolm was very critical of Christianity, he did not, in fact, suggest amending the Constitution in order to deny Christians the same free speech rights as everyone else, which Ayaan Hirsi Ali did later on. And that's in no way to take anything away from her experience, and obviously she's dealt with some horrible, horrible things. But as critical as Malcolm was, of Christianity as theology. He never suggested denying Christians the same rights as everyone else.
Well, right, but he also wanted to create, a separate, at least when he was, not at the end of his life, but...
no, not at the
end
of
his life. Well, as part of the Nation of Islam, he wanted to create a separate state that was for blacks only. He did have some ideas which would have certainly denied the rights of a large number of Christians, white people, etc.
Sure, but I mean, I think, you talk about someone whose journey from... whose sort of moderating journey is pretty inspiring. I mean, that's it right there. He came from a place of extreme suffering and like was therefore attracted to a religious radicalism that he felt would alleviate that suffering, and ultimately, came around, came around to a far more pluralistic view, which was in part the result of his conversion to Orthodox Sunni Islam, which is the religion after that they were primarily discussing here.
No, I agree with all of that, and I'm not saying that the autobiography of Malcolm X shouldn't be taught. It's a book that I enjoyed. I found it worthwhile. I like it less over time, in part because over time I tend to see Malcolm X as less of a positive figure than I did when I was in college. But it's a worthwhile...
Well, this is a whole other 3-hour blogging.
Right, but to leave all of that aside, it's a worthwhile book. All I'm saying is that, given the very clear denunciations of Christianity, I think that a book that was denouncing either Islam or Judaism similarly, it simply would not be taught in colleges and high schools the way the autobiography of Malcolm X is. And so I think that I think there's just a little bit of intellectual incoherence in terms of what we find to be acceptable criticisms of faith or ideology and what we don't.
So I'm gonna weigh in on what I think that's about, and I think it's actually I'm not going to say the experience of Judaism and Islam are similar, because I don't think they are, but what I think is true is that there is a way in which criticism of Christianity is not read as a possible future justification of violence against adherence to that religion, precisely because most Americans are Christians of some stripe. Whereas criticism, people are justifiably sensitive about criticism of that kind of harsh criticism of Judaism because of the history of Jewish persecution and the near annihilation of Jews from planet Earth.
Yes,
and I think the same is true of Islam, even though obviously there are 1.4 billion Muslims. The same is true in the sense that some people have this view of the West being in a clash of civilizations with Islam, and as a result, those criticisms can easily double as justifications for violence, for war or something of this sort. I think you make an interesting point about Christianity, and when you're talking about Scientology, I was thinking is that the other sort of religion that's come in for that kind of criticism is actually Catholicism, and I wonder if and obviously that's in part to do with the horrendous child molestation scandal, but I think that there's a structural issue here, where I think that something like Scientology, or even like the Catholic Church, which has a sort of centralized hierarchical structure, I think people have a much easier time criticizing structures like that because they feel like they know there's an individual to blame, or individuals to blame, in a way that there isn't necessarily in a way that it might sound like you're criticizing adherents of that religion instead of the people who are in charge of that religion. If that makes any sense, I don't hear a lot of people
it makes sense
trashing individual Scientologists, but I hear a lot of people going after David Miscavige, and I don't hear a lot of I hear a lot of people trashing Catholic theology or the Catholic hierarchy for its strict interpretations of certain things like gay rights, abortion, birth control. But I don't necessarily hear people saying Catholics in general are really terrible.
Right. But I mean, you have, and obviously, you have two major branches of Islam. You have Shiism and Sunni Islam. Shiism tends to use kind of a rough metaphor. Shiism tends to be a bit more like Catholicism. Sunni Islam tends to be a bit more like Protestantism. Shiism is more hierarchical. So, I mean, I think actually in the case of Shia Islam, people don't have a problem in the United States criticizing, the Iranian regime, which is, a theocratic regime that has its own clerical hierarchy. I mean, and I think that there's something to that, though you have, similar structures, not identical, but somewhat similar structures within Sunni Islam in the four madhabs, or the four major jurisprudential schools, where one could fashion, a similar critique that focuses on jurisprudence that they find to be problematic. But getting to the point you made before about the different treatment of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. I think you make legitimate points, and obviously in the United States, we don't really worry about Christians being wiped out. It's not going to happen in our country. But if you look over to the Middle East, right now Christians are in the process of being wiped out. I mean, the Christian community in Iraq is under enormous threat. Coptic Christians in Egypt, they're still just under 10% of the population, but the amount of Coptic Christian migration to the West is enormous. And we now are at a time where any sort of document, any sort of writing is going to find an audience not just in the country where it was written or presented, but will find an audience globally. So to that extent, two things. Number one is we're not talking about Malcolm X anymore, but could those documents or writings that are very critical of Christianity be used elsewhere in the world to ideologically reinforce pogroms of Christians? And conversely, you and I both agree that Malcolm X was critical of Christianity because he saw what Christianity was doing to black people in the United States, what interpretations of Christianity were doing to black people in the U.S. But similarly, do we run the risk of looking at, say, a Christian civil rights activist in the Middle East and just simply branding him an Islamophobe when he's, somewhat of an equivalent of a Malcolm X?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not going to touch that.
I mean, I think those are interesting.
I know what you're saying, but I just don't feel comfortable enough with the subject matter in terms of persecution of Christians in the Middle East. And I know it exists, and I've reported on some of it, but I'm just not. I think certainly there's a way. I think this is true of anyone who there's a certain amount of space you give someone who has personally suffered,
right,
because of something, to be, just in general, to be, you give them a wide berth to say what they want to say. And you don't necessarily, it's not that you don't criticize it, but I think that it is like, I think whether, maybe, in the case of Malcolm X, I'm not saying, I don't know that because his suffering, his suffering under the so-called Christianity of the Ku Klux Klan means that he's necessarily right about Christianity in general. In the same way that, a Coptic Christian who is being treated like shit by the state apparatus of the government that is now controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, I don't necessarily think that because he's suffered because of the actions of Islamists that he's necessarily right if he paints a broad brush Islam with a broad brush. I mean, that's all I'm saying.
Right, and look, your answer there is obviously right, though. Nobody values Malcolm X for his criticism of Christianity. If that's all he had to offer, none of us would find his book to be compelling. I mean, maybe someone would, but by and large, people wouldn't, because ultimately he had something else to offer. That's why we take Malcolm X seriously. He didn't end with that. So, it's not an argument that we should take a Coptic a Coptic spokesman who is very critical of Islam, that we should take his criticisms of Islam seriously. And it's really what I'm pointing out fundamentally is just that there are differences in the way that we treat things, which I find to be I find them to be problematic. I don't find them to be utterly unjustifiable, because at the end of the day, we're people, and you don't sit around and craft an intellectual framework for how you approach issues to make sure that you're consistent from one issue to another. Usually you react when an issue crops up. And I think that's how people deal with the world. What I'm raising is just a few examples of disjuncture that I find to be both interesting and problematic. But look, at the end of the day, I think we largely agree on framework here. That when we talk about things like religion, it's far better to talk about interpretations of religion, because that's ultimately what they are. It's rare that you can find a fixed meaning. Maybe almost certainly more so in the case of both Scientology and Catholicism, where you have an interpreting authority. But when you have something with in general, the way people deal with anything that they call themselves is anarchic. And you even have people who will do this in the case of political parties, or in the case of different ideologies, saying so-and-so isn't Adam Serwer isn't a real progressive, David Gartenstein-Ross isn't a real Republican. Whatever it is, people tend to define in certain ways what an ideology or religion states, and often there's not a fixed referent one can go to. And look, so we fully agree on that. I don't think there's disagreement there. I do think, though, that looking at the inconsistencies in the way that we tend to treat things is both interesting and ultimately for those like yourself or who are at the leading edge of how we talk about and deal with these issues, it's worth thinking about.
So so just to bring it back full circle, I mean, I'm curious to add to what you think about how responsibly the media has handled this issue of religion in the context of the Boston bombings and religious motivation, and if not, or to the extent that they have not, I mean, what do you think? What do you think should be done better?
Well, okay, so there's two levels of media. One is kind of the mainstream media, which is undertaking reporting, and the other is the commentariat. In terms of kind of the mainstream reporters, I think they've been responsible. Maybe one could put an example to the contrary, because it's not like I've read everything that's out there. But what I've seen, by and large, has been responsible. In terms of the commentariat, you've had prominent examples of people immediately asking the relationship between this attack and religion. And when I say and religion, I don't mean a particularized interpretation, but between this attack and Islam writ large. I just talked with a colleague yesterday who wanted to discuss, to chat with me about Andrew Sullivan's. And Sullivan is someone who is a provocateur. He's provocative about most every issue, and the connection between Islam and terrorism is no exception in terms of what he has done in the public sphere. But I would say that to me, my own personal preference is that the wake of a terrorist attack is a poor time to have that discussion, because emotions are riding high. And in the past, look, we haven't had the wave of hate crimes against Muslims that some people portray it as, but we have had hate crimes. And so, to me, when you're dealing with an emotionally charged issue, and you're at a time of heightened sensitivity, you don't want to be the guy who's contributing to the anger of people who are less responsible than you. Andrew Sullivan is not a hateful individual. He said things that have offended a whole host of people, including Muslims, Jews, and I'm sure everyone else under the sun. But he's not a hateful man. But he's even spoken about how he thinks sometimes about, does his work give fuel to anti-Semites, to Islamophobes, even in some cases. When he writes about race, he said he thought maybe he gives fuel to racists. And I think that's true. I think he does. That doesn't mean that his discourse should be excluded, because he's not writing. He's writing for a more highbrow audience, and he's not going to hold his tongue just because somebody is going to misinterpret him or take his ideas too far. But it seems like right after a terrorist attack is a terrible time to have that discussion, both because of the potential for contributing to really bad things, and on the other hand, because of the dynamics that you outlined, Adam, where people are justifiably sensitive about such questions. It's going to lead to a much less productive discussion. So I personally wouldn't condemn Sullivan any more than I would condemn him for many of his other provocative writings. But it seems to me like, in this case, it's not a very good time to have that discussion.
My one beef, and I don't think it's with the media. I think it's also with the commentariat. I just think, we're seeing there's lots of evidence of motivation, of religious radicalism, religious identity politics being behind the bombing. But I just think the media is, I think, being pretty responsible with drawing that out, and I think the commentariat has been leaping to conclusions from the beginning in a way that isn't helpful.
Absolutely, and look, we tend to do that. When I say we, I mean the commentariat tends to do that. You'll recall, if you looking outside of the Islamic context, at other terrorist attacks you've had, like the shooting of Gabby Giffords, which arguably wasn't terrorism because the guy was crazy, but right away people were ascribing motives to him. Same thing with the flying of the IRS building, of a plane into the IRS building in Austin, Texas, a few years back, which people were linking to the far right. Whereas if you look at the guy's manifesto, it's much more politically ambiguous. That was clearly an act of terrorism, but the popular interpretation given to it, to me, as someone who spent a lot of time looking at that document, didn't really match my own reading of that document. So people, look, we tend to want to ascribe fixed meanings to what motivated people right away, whereas human motivation is a very complex thing. So I fully agree with you on that point.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the more interesting things about Tamerlan, who I think, everybody's pretty much decided he was motivated by religion, but I think the big wrinkle in that interpretation, of course, is that he was still trying to be a citizen, right up until he planted that bomb. Which sort of, it says to me, if you're already a legal resident of the United States, you don't actually need, citizenship is important if you're, outside the United States or something like that. If you're... citizenship wasn't important to what he ultimately wanted to do. If what he wanted to do was bomb the Boston Marathon, right? Citizenship, it makes me wonder to what extent religion becomes the sort of ad hoc justification for what is his anger and rage at being rejected by the country that he unsuccessfully sought to be a part of for so many years.
Right.
And I think that it's that the fact that he was still trying to be a citizen 6 months before the bombing and was unable to be because of a domestic violence arrest, although I don't think he was convicted. I think that really throws a wrinkle into the whole thing and sort of says, even if religion played a role in it, and I think it's becoming, the evidence is becoming very strong that it did, there was also something else going on here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, look, we're less than 2 weeks out from from the attack itself. It's been 10 days since the attack. We're just about a week out from having learned who the perpetrators are. 1 week is too soon to definitively say what someone's motivation is. Look, and to me, looking at this compared to other cases that clearly were motivated by jihadist ideology, cases that I've done field research on and read every relevant document, there are a lot of commonalities such that I think that it's exactly right that this is the leading theory. If I were placing money, as I said before, for Tamerlan, I would certainly place money on him being motivated by jihadist ideology and by his own beliefs in that regard. But I think that the objection that you put your finger on, which I agree with, is the commentariat tends to be too quick in reaching conclusions. I think that and look, perhaps in part I'm influenced by the fact that I consider myself an analyst, not a pundit. And generally as an analyst, you deal with probabilities. I put the probability very high in terms of Tamerlan's motivation being related to jihadist ideology, but very high is not the same as 100%. One has to make room for competing explanations, competing theories. Now, at the end of the day, I'm not sure if we can ever have a commentariat that's really good at doing that, because the way I think about most things is just not the way most people think about things. And to be perfectly blunt, if everybody talked about things the way that I do, the commentariat would be a whole hell of a lot more boring. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I think it's a fine place to leave it out. Thank you so much for coming on the show, David. All right, take care.